Welcome, the anointed ones. Some chapters don't close with noise, apologies, or explanations. They close because the structure that required them collapsed. This message is not a hype speech, and it's definitely not one of those dramatic announcements that try to scare you into believing something big is happening. What's happening here is quieter, sharper, and far more final. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself with fireworks, but with a strange sense of relief you didn't even know you were carrying around. The kind where you wake up one day and realize the weight you've been dragging has simply stopped dragging back. Here's a grounded fact most people don't talk about. The human brain doesn't let go of repeated stress until it registers completion. Not hope, not optimism, completion. That's why some cycles repeat for years, even after you've healed, prayed, journaled, talked it out, and tried to be the bigger person. The nervous system keeps the file open until the lesson is fully processed and integrated. What you're feeling now isn't confusion. It's closure finally syncing up with your body. And that's why this moment feels unfamiliar. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just oddly calm. You're not bracing for impact anymore. You're not rehearsing survival strategies in your head. You're not explaining yourself to imaginary people in the shower. That alone should tell you something has shifted at a level deeper than motivation or mindset. What makes this even stranger, and yes, slightly ironic, is that the moment it's truly done, there's no parade, no announcement, no voice in the sky. Life doesn't clap. It just removes the obstacle and keeps moving like, all right, next. And you're standing there thinking, wait, that's it? After all that? Almost rude, honestly. This is the part nobody prepares you for. The end of a heavy chapter doesn't feel heavy. It feels anticlimactic, almost boring. And that's how you know it's real. Because when something no longer has emotional charge, it no longer has authority. The drama is gone. The pull is gone. Even the urge to prove what you survived quietly disappears. This message is for the ones who didn't just endure. You completed something. You didn't escape it. You didn't outsmart it. You outgrew the conditions that made it possible. And when that happens, life doesn't send you back for a sequel. Congratulations. Not in a loud way, in a final way. Number 1. The cycle didn't end because you became stronger. It ended because the lesson ran out of value. Most people think pain leaves when you finally prove you're tough enough to handle it. That idea sounds noble, but it's wrong. Pain doesn't stick around to admire your endurance. It stays because it's still extracting something from you. The moment it stops teaching, it stops qualifying for a return visit. That's what actually happened here. You didn't win by surviving longer. You graduated because there was nothing left to learn. For a long time, that situation kept replaying because each round revealed something you hadn't fully seen yet. It exposed where you overgave, where you doubted your own perception, where you tolerated confusion instead of clarity. Every repeat wasn't punishment. It was feedback. Harsh feedback, yes, but precise. Once you finally understood the pattern instead of just feeling the pain, the cycle lost its usefulness. Here's the uncomfortable truth people avoid. Pain doesn't leave just because you're tired of it. It leaves when you stop misinterpreting it. As long as you thought the problem was them, fate, timing, or bad luck, the lesson stayed open. The moment you recognized what the experience was training you to notice within yourself, the system shut it down. No drama, no negotiation, just done. That's why this ending feels different from the others. You're not exhausted in the same way. You're not trying to convince yourself it's over. There's a quiet certainty now, the kind that doesn't need reassurance. That certainty is the signal that the lesson has been fully absorbed. Once understanding replaces confusion, repetition becomes pointless. This is also why the same kind of pain won't work on you again. Not because life suddenly became gentle, but because you don't need that method of instruction anymore. You learned discernment. You learned when to walk away instead of pushing harder. You learned that suffering isn't proof of growth, clarity is. So no, this chapter didn't close because you were strong enough to keep enduring it. It closed because endurance was no longer required. The lesson finished its job, packed its bags, and left without saying goodbye. That's how real completion happens. Quiet, clean, and final. Number 2. You're no longer compatible with the version of pain that once had access to you. What once shook you to your core, what once made your chest tighten and your mind spin, no longer has the same effect. The truth is brutal and simple. The version of you that allowed that pain to take root doesn't exist anymore. The fear, the self-doubt, the hesitation, those were all conditions that pain needed to survive. Once those conditions changed, the old pain couldn't attach itself the way it used to. It's not that life has suddenly become easier, it's that you have changed at a level deep enough that the old triggers don't recognize you. You've recalibrated. Your perception, your instincts, your responses have evolved to a point where the same scenarios that once caused chaos now feel foreign. You observe without reacting. You recognize without absorbing. The system that once allowed emotional assaults to destabilize you has been upgraded. This is why some people around you are still fighting the same battles and still bleeding over the same issues, while you walk past them untouched. They haven't changed. You have. And because you've changed, the old rules no longer apply. There's a strange freedom in this. You realize you've been living in a world where survival depended on tolerating what you shouldn't have, and now that tolerance is gone. You don't meet old energy with old energy because it no longer resonates with your structure. You don't absorb confusion or manipulation because your internal frequency is incompatible. The same people, the same situations, the same lies. They hit like empty noise. This is why the cycle cannot return. It's not about defense mechanisms or resistance. It's about fundamental incompatibility. The pain that once had authority over your mind and body simply can't operate on this version of you. You have become a vessel that the old suffering cannot inhabit. You are not weaker. You are not indifferent. You are different in a way that makes repetition impossible. The chapter isn't just closed, it's locked, with a new key that only you hold, and the old pain is left standing outside, powerless and irrelevant. Number 3. What tried to break you lost jurisdiction over you. There was a time when people, circumstances, and even your own mind had authority over your emotions and decisions. Every harsh word, every betrayal, every manipulation was like a law enforced against you, and you followed it without question. You obeyed because the system had jurisdiction. It had control over your reactions, your sense of worth, and your very sense of self. That jurisdiction isn't just about external pressure. It's about the internal contracts you unconsciously signed. Guilt, fear, hope, and loyalty acted as the clauses that allowed others to have power over you. But something shifted. Somewhere along the line, whether consciously or not, you revoked that authority. You stopped giving permission for others to dictate your emotional reality. The law that once governed your reactions has been officially repealed. The people who once had influence over your mind now have nothing more than empty titles. Their power is symbolic, meaningless, and ineffective because you no longer recognize it. They try and fail. You respond, not because they command it, but because you choose it. This isn't arrogance, it isn't detachment, it's sovereignty. You've understood that true freedom isn't about avoiding challenges, it's about owning the space within yourself where no one else can legislate your feelings. The emotional blackmail, the gaslighting, The manipulations that used to leave you paralyzed now hit like static. You don't fight it, and you don't ignore it. You simply exist outside its jurisdiction. The most striking part of this shift is how quietly it happens. Nobody calls out that your autonomy has been restored. You don't get an announcement, a certificate, or a medal. You just notice one day that the things that used to destabilize you no longer matter. The control others tried to wield evaporated because the internal permission to be governed has been revoked. That is power. That is finality. That is why the chapter can't repeat itself. The authority that once broke you doesn't exist anymore, and that is an irreversible change. Number 4. You stopped negotiating with suffering and started listening to yourself. For years, the struggle wasn't just with the circumstances themselves. It was with the internal argument you kept having about them. You tried to reason with the pain, justify it, make sense of it, bargain with it. You asked yourself why it happened, how it could have been different, and what you could do to make it stop. That negotiation kept you tethered to the cycle, like a leash you couldn't break. Suffering has no real power over someone who refuses to negotiate, and for the longest time, you were offering terms that kept it in place. The turning point came when you shifted from debate to observation, from bargaining to understanding. You stopped asking why it had to happen and started asking what it was showing you. Every sting, every betrayal, every setback transformed from an attack into information. You listened to yourself, your instincts, your boundaries, your truths, instead of arguing with the force that once dominated you. That listening changed everything. Suddenly, what was once a recurring nightmare lost its leverage. Suffering thrives on confusion and self-betrayal. When you finally stopped betraying yourself, it stopped holding weight. This is why the chapter ended decisively. The moment you stopped negotiating with pain, you reclaimed control over your narrative. You stopped allowing external circumstances to dictate your emotional state. You stopped being a hostage to what was never meant to define you. Every time pain tried to sneak back in, it found no opening, no contract, no loophole. You became impermeable not by force, but by alignment. The transformation is subtle but absolute. Life doesn't have to punish you to teach you anything anymore. You are no longer negotiating with reality, with people, or with trauma. You are listening to yourself with the authority of someone who knows the lesson is complete. That's why repetition is impossible. That's why the cycle doesn't return. You didn't just survive. You recalibrated the relationship between your inner voice and the world outside. You stopped making deals with suffering, and the moment you did, the old chapter closed forever. Number 5. You are no longer punishable by the same emotional weapons. There was a time when words could wound you, actions could destabilize you, and situations could make you doubt everything about yourself. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, all of it felt like a sentence you couldn't escape. The emotional weapons aimed at you had authority because you recognized their power. Your nervous system, your beliefs, your perception of reality were all the battlegrounds where these attacks landed, and for a long time they left permanent marks. Now none of that works. Not because the weapons have disappeared, or because life suddenly became gentler, but because you have changed. Your understanding, your awareness, and your boundaries have evolved to a point where the old strategies no longer affect you. Gaslighting, guilt trips, intimidation, or abandonment attempts hit like blunt instruments against armor that wasn't there before. The person who once feared their own reactions now watches the same moves bounce off, powerless and irrelevant. You didn't grow immune by accident. You recalibrated the system that allowed influence over you in the first place. This is not numbness, and it's not indifference. It's clarity and authority. You know exactly what's being attempted, and it no longer carries weight. The manipulation that once had the power to twist your emotions now registers as empty noise. You no longer grant it validity, and without that internal permission, no weapon can function. The people or circumstances that relied on exploiting your fear, insecurity, or loyalty are suddenly ineffective because the rules of engagement have changed. The significance of this shift is profound. It means the cycle can't repeat because the tools of repetition no longer operate on you. The same tactics that once dismantled your peace and confidence are now powerless against a version of yourself that sees through them before they even land. This is sovereignty. This is unshakable presence. You didn't just survive the attacks, you nullified their authority, and that is why the chapter is closed forever. Number 6. The pain completed its assignment, and it was never meant to stay. Pain isn't a permanent fixture. It's not a badge of honor, a punishment, or a lifelong sentence. Its purpose is specific, tactical, and temporary. The moment you realize that, everything about your past struggles begins to make sense. The experiences that once felt endless, oppressive, and unfair had a job to teach you something you couldn't learn any other way. Every betrayal, setback, and disappointment was a precise instrument, shaping, exposing, and instructing. And once it delivered what it came to deliver, it left. For years, you might have thought the suffering was endless, as if the universe or the people in your life had some personal vendetta against you. That's the trap. Pain doesn't overstay its welcome. It only seems persistent when the lesson isn't fully absorbed. Once you internalize the truth, once you recognize the patterns, and once you understood the deeper implications, the assignment was complete. That's why the same circumstance or person can never torment you the same way again. Their influence only existed as long as the lesson remained unfinished. This completion is subtle and often underestimated. There's no grand announcement, no divine trumpet. You just notice a quiet shift. The tension lifts, the emotional tug disappears, and the energy that once demanded your attention becomes irrelevant. That's how pain knows its work is done. It fades, not because it's weak, but because it has no more value to extract. The brilliance of this system is that it doesn't rely on external validation or timing. It doesn't need apologies, recognition, or closure from the source. Its job was to teach you about yourself, about boundaries, about clarity, and about strength. When that teaching is absorbed fully, the experience itself becomes obsolete. This is why the chapter is over. The pain is gone, not by accident, not by avoidance, and not by pretending it didn't happen. It's gone because it accomplished its mission. You didn't just survive the experience. You extracted its intelligence and upgraded yourself in a way that repetition becomes impossible. Completion has a quiet authority, and now you are living proof. Number 7. You crossed the line where survival turns into sovereignty. Survival is raw, instinctive, and reactive. It's about holding on, protecting yourself, and getting through each day with as little damage as possible. Sovereignty, on the other hand, is entirely different. It's not about reacting. It's about commanding your own space, your own mind, and your own energy. It's the point where you no longer bend to external pressure, where fear loses its leverage, and where the choices you make are rooted in truth rather than desperation. Crossing that line doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the lessons have been internalized, when the weight you once carried is fully understood, and when your inner authority reaches a critical mass. At this stage, the world can throw the same chaos, manipulation, or betrayal at you, and it will fail to penetrate. Not because you've built walls or learned defensive maneuvers, but because the internal framework that once allowed disturbance has been reconstructed. You operate from a new center, one that is grounded, unshakable, and fully aware. That is sovereignty. You no longer fight to survive. You no longer seek approval, validation, or reassurance. You exist as your own law, your own authority, and your own standard. The shift is subtle but irreversible. Survival is conditional. It depends on circumstances, other people, and the patterns of the past. Sovereignty is absolute. It depends only on who you are now, fully embodied. That is why what tried to control or destabilize you in the past now fails. You no longer respond with fear, hesitation, or self-doubt. Your presence alone communicates that the chapter is over, that the patterns are finished, and that the old dynamics have no currency here. This is the stage where repetition becomes impossible. You don't just survive the storm, you exist above it. You don't endure the manipulation, you are beyond it. Crossing from survival into sovereignty marks a boundary that cannot be breached. That line is permanent, and once crossed, it signals the absolute closure of what once held power over you. You are not just free, you are unassailable, and that is why this chapter is finished forever. Number 8. Your discernment matured faster than your circumstances could keep up. There comes a point when your understanding of people, situations, and intentions surpasses what the world around you is prepared to deliver. You've been forced to see patterns, detect deception, and read between lines in ways that demanded every ounce of your focus and clarity. While others were still reacting, negotiating, or hoping for explanations, your discernment sharpened into something precise and unrelenting. You began to notice subtleties that would have been invisible to your previous self, and that awareness changed everything. This maturity didn't come from luck or easy lessons. It came from direct exposure to reality at its harshest and its most unfiltered. Every betrayal, every manipulation, every situation designed to confuse you became raw material for the expansion of your perception. While life around you continued to operate on outdated patterns, you upgraded your internal software. You saw through motives, read intentions before they were acted out, and recognized the strategies that once held you captive. That is why the old cycles can no longer repeat. Your discernment arrives before the trap is even set. The gap between your awareness and the circumstances you encountered creates a kind of immunity. People, conflicts, and manipulations that once had the power to derail you now feel clumsy, almost amateurish. Your internal radar is too calibrated for the old tactics to work. The stage that used to support drama collapses because the observer has changed. You see what is hidden, you understand what is unspoken, and you no longer step into the snares that were once unavoidable. This kind of maturity is silent, but its effects are undeniable. It doesn't require confrontation or demonstration. It simply shifts the balance of energy so that repetition becomes impossible. Your environment may remain the same, but you navigate it with an authority that renders the old scripts meaningless. The circumstances cannot catch up, and the cycles cannot continue. What once took months or years to process now registers instantly, and that speed of comprehension ensures that the chapter is closed, finalized, and unrepeated. Your discernment doesn't just protect you. It declares in the clearest terms that the old rules no longer apply. Number 9. You no longer need suffering to validate your worth or growth. For a long time, pain felt like proof. Proof that you were evolving, that you were special, that your life had meaning beyond the ordinary. Every betrayal, every hardship, every moment of struggle became a measure of your value, as if enduring it elevated you above others. That mindset kept the cycle alive because it tied your sense of self to the very thing that was trying to break you. You measured your worth by how much you could survive, and in doing so, you gave suffering the authority to define you. The shift happens when you finally realize that growth and worth are not dependent on suffering. You stop equating pain with legitimacy. You stop thinking that your resilience is validated only when the world continues to challenge you in the same old ways. That realization doesn't come gently. It comes as a quiet recognition that you have absorbed the lessons, integrated the wisdom, and no longer require proof from hardship to confirm who you are. Your growth becomes self-evident. Your worth becomes intrinsic. This change is transformative because it breaks the cycle at its core. Pain can only linger when it is given meaning, when it is allowed to act as a measure of value or a standard of growth. Once you reclaim that measure for yourself, suffering loses its leverage. The events, the people, and the circumstances that once tested you no longer hold authority over your sense of self. You no longer need to prove, endure, or perform to validate your existence. That is why this chapter cannot repeat. The internal contract that sustained the suffering has been terminated. You don't seek validation through struggle anymore. You have internalized your power, your insight, and your self-worth. Growth has been achieved not through repeated trials, but through understanding and integration. Suffering becomes irrelevant, not absent. It simply no longer serves a function in your life. You don't need it. You don't measure yourself against it. You have transcended it, and that is why the chapter is over, closed, and will not return. Number 10. The version of you that tolerated that treatment no longer exists. The person who once stayed silent, who accepted manipulation, betrayal, and disregard, is gone. That version of you existed because the circumstances demanded it, because your sense of self was still learning the rules of engagement with the world. You tolerated what was unacceptable not because it was deserved, but because you hadn't yet built the internal structures necessary to refuse it. That version of you measured loyalty, love, and survival through compromise and endurance, giving authority to those who had no right to wield it. Now, that person has been retired. The version of you who once allowed others to dictate your worth, manipulate your choices, or undermine your confidence has been replaced by someone entirely different. Someone unrecognizable to those who tried to control you. This is not a shift in attitude or a temporary stance. It is an identity upgrade. The boundaries are now inherent, the clarity is internal, and the respect you demand begins and ends with yourself. What once caused turmoil now meets calm authority. What once created fear now meets steady observation. The transformation is profound because it eliminates the possibility of repetition. The same people, tactics, or circumstances cannot operate on someone who no longer exists in the same form. You can no longer be gaslit, manipulated, or coerced in ways that once felt inevitable. The lessons have been fully integrated, and your presence alone communicates that the old rules no longer apply. Attempts to provoke, destabilize, or control you now feel futile, almost absurd, because they are addressing a version of you that no longer walks the world. This is why the chapter is truly closed. The cycle cannot restart, the patterns cannot replicate, and the energy that once fueled your suffering has no entry point. You are operating from a completely new blueprint, one that demands respect, clarity, and autonomy. The person who tolerated that treatment was necessary for the growth, but that version of you has been permanently replaced by someone who simply cannot be reached in the same way. That is why this chapter is finished, final, and unrepeatable. Number 11. You stopped confusing loyalty with self-erasure. For a long time you gave pieces of yourself away in the name of loyalty, convinced that enduring mistreatment, compromise, or betrayal was proof of your commitment. You mistook endurance for love, tolerance for devotion, and sacrifice for value. That mindset kept you trapped in cycles where your needs, boundaries, and identity were secondary to the expectations or manipulations of others. You stayed silent. You adjusted. You forgave. And in doing so, you allowed yourself to be defined by what others demanded, rather than by who you truly were. The turning point comes when you finally recognize the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. Loyalty is not giving your soul as collateral. It does not demand that you compromise your integrity, tolerate abuse, or lose your voice to prove devotion. Self-erasure, on the other hand, disguises itself as loyalty. It convinces you that bending, submitting, or staying silent is noble, when in reality it erodes your identity and reinforces the very cycles that harm you. Once that distinction is clear, everything changes. You start honoring your boundaries, protecting your energy, and valuing your voice without guilt. You stop participating in systems or relationships that require you to vanish to prove your worth. This shift is radical because it makes repetition impossible. The people or situations that once relied on your self-erasure can no longer operate the same way. Your energy is no longer a resource for others to exploit under the guise of loyalty. You interact with the world from a place of integrity, not obligation, and that changes the entire dynamic. The manipulations, betrayals, and pressures that once held sway now meet a version of you that refuses to collapse or comply. Breaking the habit of self-erasure is quiet but powerful. It closes doors on the past, not with anger or drama, but with authority and clarity. You are no longer a participant in the cycles that once defined your existence. By distinguishing loyalty from self-erasure, you reclaim your identity, your energy, and your power. That is why the chapter is over, irreversible, and will never repeat. You have drawn the line, and nothing that once held you hostage can cross it again. Number 12. Your intuition no longer whispers. It issues final notices. There was a time when your intuition spoke softly, a subtle nudge you could ignore or second guess. You debated it, rationalized it, or silenced it because the signals weren't loud enough to demand obedience. That quiet knowing existed alongside fear, confusion, and doubt, and that mixture kept you tethered to cycles that repeated again and again. The quiet voice of instinct wasn't strong enough to override the programming that allowed manipulation, betrayal, and chaos to take root. You listened selectively, and that partial listening left the door open. Now everything is different. Your intuition no longer whispers. It announces itself with authority. It doesn't leave room for hesitation or negotiation. It doesn't ask for permission to be followed. It issues final notices, unmistakable and uncompromising. When your instincts signal that something is wrong, you respond immediately, not because you've built a strategy or rehearsed a reaction, but because the internal alarm has become absolute. The same patterns that once lured you into traps now trigger immediate recognition and decisive action. The cycles that used to drain your energy, destabilize your peace, and distort your judgment have no chance of repeating. This transformation isn't just about heightened perception. It's about sovereignty. Your knowing is no longer optional. It is operational. The people, circumstances, and tactics that relied on your hesitation, doubt, or internal conflict can no longer function the way they once did. You move through the world guided by unshakable internal authority, and that authority leaves no room for repetition of old pain. The significance is profound. This is why the chapter is permanently closed. It is not that challenges will disappear, but that the version of you that could be misled, manipulated, or destabilized has been replaced by someone fully attuned to truth. Your intuition acts like a final notice, signaling that anything misaligned with your integrity will be recognized and dismissed instantly. The old patterns cannot take hold because your inner guidance no longer negotiates, it commands. That is why the chapter is finished, irreversible, and unrepeatable. Number 13. What comes next requires space that suffering used to occupy. The reason this chapter is over isn't just because you learned the lessons or set boundaries. It's because what's ahead for you cannot coexist with the weight, chaos, and energy drain of the experiences you just endured. Every moment of suffering, betrayal, or manipulation took up space in your mind, body, and spirit. That space was necessary at the time. It held the lessons, the growth, and the integration. But now the room that pain occupied has been cleared, not just metaphorically, but structurally. Life doesn't just leave gaps empty, it prepares them for what comes next. And what is coming for you requires clarity, capacity, and alignment that the old suffering would have crowded out. This is why the chapter cannot return. You've made room internally in ways that the cycle of pain cannot penetrate. The emotional, mental, and spiritual space once filled with doubt, fear, and endurance is now reserved for insight, wisdom, and self-mastery. The old energy has no place to land, no leverage to exert, and no resonance with the new version of you. That emptiness isn't void, it's potential, preparedness, and readiness. It allows you to receive what was previously impossible, to act with precision, and to navigate life from a space of sovereignty rather than reaction. What's remarkable is how quiet and natural this feels. There's no drama, no fanfare, no external announcement that this transformation has occurred. It simply exists. A structural shift inside that you notice in the way decisions are easier, choices are clearer, and obstacles that used to dominate your focus now feel irrelevant. The world may still present challenges, but the patterns that used to bind you can't operate in the new environment you've created within yourself. The space that suffering vacated is not empty. It is the foundation for everything that's next. That is why repetition is impossible. What comes next requires someone whole, aware, and unbound, and that is exactly what you are now. The chapter is complete, permanently closed, and prepared you for a life that cannot be constrained by old cycles. Number 14. This is not a pause, a break, or a reward. It's a permanent structural shift. The reason you will never go through that chapter again is not because life decided to give you a reprieve, or because circumstances finally became favorable, or even because you survived long enough to deserve it. This is far deeper than any temporary pause or fleeting relief. What has occurred is a permanent structural shift within you, a transformation so fundamental that the old cycles no longer have a framework to operate. The architecture of your mind, your emotions, and your sense of self has been rebuilt from the ground up, and the elements that once held those painful experiences in place simply cannot function in this new structure. This is the type of change that is quiet yet absolute. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks, it doesn't demand acknowledgement, and it doesn't leave room for nostalgia. The version of you that tolerated confusion, manipulation, and betrayal has been replaced by someone who moves through life with clarity, authority, and self-sovereignty. The systems, people, and patterns that once held power over you are incompatible with this new version of you. The chapter is closed because the structural foundations that allowed it to exist have been permanently altered. There is no going back, no loopholes, and no unfinished business that can pull you into the same cycles. The significance of this shift is immense. It means your energy, focus, and presence are now reserved for what aligns with your integrity, vision, and growth. The old mechanisms of pain, manipulation, or coercion cannot penetrate your defenses because the defenses are not temporary shields. They are permanent transformations built into the very framework of your being. This is why the closure feels different from anything before. It isn't a reward or a lucky break. It's final, absolute, and irreversible. You are no longer living in reaction to external forces. You are existing from a place of internal authority. The cycle cannot repeat because the foundation it relied on no longer exists. What has shifted within you is permanent, and that is why this chapter is truly finished, irreversibly closed, and will never return. Conclusion. You have reached the point where everything that once held power over you has been dismantled, not by luck, not by chance, and certainly not by endurance alone. Every cycle, every trial, every moment of suffering served a purpose, and that purpose has been fulfilled. The pain, the manipulation, the betrayal, all of it has completed its assignment, and in doing so, it reshaped you into someone fundamentally different, someone untouchable by the patterns that once dictated your life. You are no longer defined by the chaos of the past, no longer tethered to cycles that used to drain you, and no longer required to prove your worth through struggle. What you have now is clarity, sovereignty, and an internal authority that cannot be undermined. This transformation is more than personal growth. It is structural, permanent, and irreversible. The version of you that tolerated, doubted, or gave away pieces of itself no longer exists. Every instinct, every boundary, every ounce of discernment has evolved to operate on a higher plane, one that the old cycles cannot reach. You are now walking through life not reacting, not negotiating, not surviving, but existing from a place of complete alignment where the past cannot touch you and where repetition is impossible. The chapter is closed in the most absolute sense. There is no sequel, no rerun, no unfinished business. What comes next requires the space and clarity that you have created, and that space is now fully yours to fill with purpose, power, and truth. Let this be the final word on the experiences that once weighed you down. They have served their purpose, and now your energy, focus, and presence are reserved for what aligns with your highest self. You have graduated beyond survival, beyond endurance, and beyond the old rules. You are sovereign, and the world is now compelled to meet you where you stand, whole, aware, and unshakable. If this message resonates, if you feel the weight of closure and the power of transformation in your life, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content that guides, empowers, and illuminates your journey. Like this video to show support, share it with someone who needs to hear this truth, and comment below to express your own experiences or revelations. Your engagement helps create a space where others can also realize their power and claim the life they were always meant to live. This is your moment. Own it. God bless you and Happy New Year.